Hi, my name is Genevieve Graham, and I am a fiction author in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Specifically, I write historical fiction, which is a way of telling stories from history by adding fictitious characters and fictitious scenarios to bring it to life. Whether it's in books, TVs, movies, video games, historical fiction is everywhere, and it's very, very popular these days. I've always loved reading historical fiction, but I found that everything I read was based in Europe or Scotland or England or America, but there are very few books written about Canada, and that confuses me. Don't we have a good history? What's wrong with us? When I was in school, we learned about the War of 1812 and the Plains of Abraham, but I don't remember a lot more than that. My overall impression was Canadian history was boring and not really worth remembering. Why? Don't we have an interesting history up here? Where do we come from? When I moved to Nova Scotia in 2008, I suddenly saw something that I'd never seen before. I was finally living in a place that was completely surrounded by history. There were houses all around me that were well over 100 years old that were abandoned. There are cemeteries all over this place filled with generations of families that have lived here forever, not to mention all the dead that are buried after the sinking of the Titanic and the Halifax explosion. I had never heard of the Halifax explosion when I moved here. Most people here were shocked and surprised that I didn't know anything about it. But when I spoke with my friends farther out west, they didn't know about it either. And this really bugged me because this was the largest man-made explosion in Canadian history, in world history. It happened right here, and we're not talking about it anymore. I mean, we should all know about that. So I started to learn about it. I watched videos, I read books, and at the same time I started to learn about the strength of the people in Nova Scotia during that time period, during the explosion, but also during World War I. There were so many things that were happening here at that time. I'm a very visual thinker, so as I learned, I started to visualize these people that I was learning about, and they started to become my characters in the stories. So through them, I learned all different parts of the history. I learned about the suffragettes, labor laws, PTSD, which was also shell shock back then, and lots more. It's easy to see history as something far away, unimportant, and distant, especially when you look at a black and white photo like this. What historical fiction does is make that history personal. The more we research, the more color we add to these pictures in history. In this photo, we start to see the men as someone that we might have known. We can see the color of their clothing, their hair, the color of their eyes. We can see their attitudes from the way they're standing. Do they really look so different from someone that we might know today? In historical fiction, we learn how people really lived. There are a lot of different facets that we need to learn about, like how they spoke, what they wore, what they ate, their politics and their attitudes, the medicine, all the way from bloodletting to folk medicine to eventually antibiotics, their modes of transportation with the trains and the ships, electricity, technology, communication, whether it's a telegram or whether it's a letter, a handwritten letter. It's fascinating to study all the little details of their lives. When we know the tiniest details about these people, we can see how they lived, and we can look really into their stories and understand them. We can see what it might be like to actually be there and experience what they're experiencing. For example, if you have a character who's walking along the street, you need to know what she can see. Is she seeing a store? If so, what's in the shop window? What do those things cost? If she's going to buy one of them and she takes it home, how does she use it once she gets there? Every little thing matters, and it brings it all to life. In some cases, like with recent history, we can better understand the people around us. Long ago, they didn't look much different from you or I. Now they're practically invisible. What did they do with their lives? This is my first Canadian historical fiction book called Tides of Honor. This is the one about the Halifax explosion, World War I, the suffragettes, and PTSD. As I learned about Nova Scotians in World War I started imagining this 18-year-old boy who was once a fisherman, who is now living in the trenches in France. Life was suddenly very different from him. I let myself imagine how that felt, how everything had changed for him, how he was now in a place where he could watch his friends die, where he could be wounded, and he was wounded, but also how it was for him when he fell in love. When he met a woman in France and fell in love with her, I started learning about her, about where she came from and what challenges she had faced along the way. When she finally gets here, because she's going to marry him, he's a different man, having suffered in the war and now coming to terms with who he is here in Nova Scotia. So they moved to Halifax to get to know each other again, and that's when the city explodes. So now they have to learn how to find themselves and find each other again. When I was finished writing that book, I became curious about the same people only 25 years later during World War II. So many things would have changed during that time period. I had read that there were German U-boats skulking around our shore, spying on our ships as they went to and fro. I wanted to learn more about that. So I started with my black and white photo, my foundation, and I learned about the history here. I learned about what happened in the Second World War all along Nova Scotia. I learned about the people, what they were living through, what they were doing. I learned about how technology had changed. And some homes had electricity. There were switchboard operators with communication. Now the cars and trucks had replaced most of the horses. And then I learned about the Canadian forces fighting during the war, like the Navy, the Army, and the Merchant Marines. Then I went to visit the archives and sit down with the ladies that always helped me out with my stories. I told them I wanted to write about the U-boats that were around the shore during World War II. And they kind of looked at each other and they said, should we tell her about the dance? And then the others would say, no, we can't tell her about the dance. She'll never believe about the dance. So I said, now you have to tell me about the dance. So this is a very funny, hard to believe story, but it is true, that in 1942 a German U-boat was moored about 10 minutes from my house along the eastern shore of Nova Scotia. And half a dozen of the German U-boat sailors got out of their ship and went to a community dance. And some of the people that are living there still remember, oh yes, my great aunt danced with one of them. And they did speak German, but there were German settlements all around them. The very next day, they were gone. Nobody saw them again. So I took the facts of history and I fictionalized it by stranding one of them here. So it became Nazis versus Nova Scotians. The book became Come From Away, which just ended up on an Oprah list, top 24 historical romance novels of all time. So that was unexpected. While I was writing those stories, I visited the Grand Pré historical site where I learned about the Acadian expulsion of 1755. What an amazing story, another story that we all need to know about. And for that, I wrote Promises to Keep, which was then translated into French, which is only proper, seeing as it's the Acadian story. And after that, I wanted to write about something to do with the Mounties. The Mounties are the #1 most recognizable symbol of Canada internationally, which is a very interesting statistic. And I wanted to know why. Where did they get this reputation for courage and strength? And I couldn't figure out how to write about it. I didn't want to write a chronological story. I needed to write something that had an adventure to it that showed us who they were. Then one day I ran across information about the Klondike gold rush, which I did not realize was a Canadian thing. It was Canadian because of the Mounties. And that's where I learned everything I needed to learn about these men and where their reputation came from. Through their work, the rules they put in place, and the way they enforced them, they saved tens of thousands of lives. It was an amazing story, learning about these men and the adventure, and it became my biggest adventure story. Here's a piece of Canadian history that very few people know about, and one I found irresistible. Between 1869 and 1948, over 120,000 destitute children were shipped from England to Canada to work as indentured servants. 75% of those children were neglected, abused, or killed by their Canadian masters. Many of them were taken without their parents' permission, and most of them never told their story to anyone because they were too ashamed to tell it. I believe that the British home children is a very important story to be told. In school, I learned about the War of 1812 and the Plains of Abraham, but I didn't learn about 120,000 children who eventually helped pioneer this country for what it is now. Over 12% of Canada's population is descended from these children now, over 4 million people, and most of them have no idea. What I just told you is the black and white photo of the history. I did a great deal of research afterwards to find out more about these children and where they came from. But then I had to colorize it. I had to get more of the details in it. And what I did, it was the most exciting research I had done and one that I highly recommend. I started interviewing some of the descendants of the British home children who really wanted to tell their stories. They told the actual stories in a survey that I put out, and I had over 200 responses to that survey telling me about what their ancestors had survived. So I used those actual experiences to create my characters. And again, it resulted in The Forgotten Home Child, which was on the Canadian bestseller list for 19 weeks, 11 of those weeks at #1. Clearly, Canadians want to learn more about our country's history, and I will continue to tell them stories. I write one book every year. Canadian history is not boring. I grew up with a list like this, but through creating historical fiction, we can imagine those events and more like this. How can you make history come alive? Is there a moment in Canadian history or in your own family that intrigues you? Is it a story that deserves to be told? Trying to put yourself in that story will demand a few things from you. First, you need to establish the black and white photo, the foundation, and the history. Learn the basics of that time period or the event. Second, dive into the research and learn details about the time period, like food and fashion, politics, technology, communications, economics, everything that you can learn. When you're finally comfortable with all that information, drop yourself into the picture. Become one of the characters. If you need to learn more, you can always add in research as you go. Are you ready to try? Here are some writing prompts for you. What if you've been standing behind a protected cement wall the moment that Halifax exploded? What do you see when you come out? Describe the survivors that you see around you, the houses, the scene around you, the sounds, and how you feel. To write this, what do you need? The black and white photo means that you have to research the Halifax explosion. Know the date that it happened and why it happened. Know the time of year because you'll need to know what people are wearing and what your character feels. When you come out, are you deafened? Do you start to slowly hear sounds over time? What do you see on the ground? Because if you did your research, you'll know there was a tsunami that came in and just littered the ground with all sorts of stuff. What do you see around you? What about the people around you? Are you injured? If so, where do you go? Who's going to help you? Can you help anyone around you? Where can you get food to eat? And how is your mind dealing with all this devastation? Here's another prompt. Imagine you're standing in one of the old abandoned houses along the eastern shore of Nova Scotia, or the western shore, wherever you are in Nova Scotia, and the house is over 150 years old. You're in there all by yourself, and you open a door, or maybe there's a portal, and you walk through. What happens if you arrive in the other side of that door on the day that that house was built? What do you see? Who are you now? What's going on around you? Or you have a job as the advice columnist in the Halifax Chronicle or Nova Scotia Gazette in a specific year, 1900, 1870, 1970, whenever. What kinds of questions are people asking about? How will you respond? At the end of your workday, what are you thinking about on your way home? How about if you were in an art museum and the Mona Lisa waved at you and asked you to come on and talk with her? She shows you around her world. What's the conversation like? Does she speak differently from you? What do you see and hear? And finally, it's 1939. You are 18. And Canada has just gone to war. How do you feel? Will you go to fight? Why or why not? How do the people around you react to what you're saying, to your decision? What will you do next? How do you feel about the conflict going on in Germany and Poland? What do you know, and how much are you actually learning through the radio and newspaper? This is how a story begins, and I hope that after today you're able to find one yourself. The trick to historical fiction is learning all the details and then bringing them alive through your creativity and research. I'm glad I was able to speak with you today, and I hope that you can now see that there's a very exciting history going on in Canada. Please come and visit me anytime online.